I'll be the moderator for this session. Sorry about the tardiness. I think we're running behind schedule a bit. Therefore, the panel is scheduled to run for an hour, so there's no time to waste. This is the Media and Memory breakout session. What has been the role of media institutions in promoting or suppressing colonial injustices and reparations narratives? So I'll just go ahead and introduce my panelists. So first of all, we have Ngartia Mūrūthi. Sorry, give me one moment. We have Ngartia Mūrūthi. Ngartia is a Kenyan writer, poet, and storyteller whose creative work engages identity, orature, and public power. Based in Nairobi, he began as a spoken word performer and has since expanded into theater, acting, screenwriting, and short fiction. His writing explores the politics of narrative, often with sharp insight into the structures of authority. Bold on authority. Welcome, Ngartia. Next, we have Joseph Harker. Joseph Harker is the senior editor for diversity and development at the UK-based newspaper The Guardian. He is responsible for embedding inclusion practices across the newsroom and oversees initiatives that support emerging journalists from underrepresented backgrounds. Previously, he edited and published the weekly newspaper Black Britain and served as deputy opinion editor at The Guardian. On the panel, Joseph will bring a global perspective on representation, media ethics, and institutional change. Welcome, Joseph. Next, we have Beatrice Maina. Beatrice Maina is Beatrice Maina Waithera, before she strangles me. Beatrice is a Kenyan journalist and human rights advocate who has been active in public protests and grassroots campaigns, particularly around accountability and sexual gender-based violence. Holding a degree in journalism, she has worked with women's networks to shine a light on corruption and civic freedom. As a panelist, Beatrice brings the lived experience of activism and media, a vital voice for those whose stories too often go unheard. Welcome, Beatrice. Last but not least, Christine Mungai. So Christine is a Kenyan journalist, writer, and media curator based in Nairobi. She was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University in 2018 and has written for outlets including The Washington Post, The Boston Globe, and Al Jazeera English. Christine also served as lead curator at Baraza Media Lab. She was my predecessor, developing programs for public interest storytelling and media innovation in Africa. She is currently a news editor at The Continent, and she joins the panel as someone deeply engaged in how stories are shaped and how media can be a force of change. Welcome, Chris. So just a caveat, media and reparations conversation is very underexplored across the continent, but mostly in Africa. There's so many nuances to it, and so I would invite you to help us co-create this session, mostly with your questions and your comments at the end of the panel discussion. You're welcome. This is a safe space for us to learn, explore, and grow in this path together. I thought that before exploring such a serious conversation, it's important to have some form of artistic expression. And Ngartia volunteered to ease us into the session just before we go into the serious discussion. So welcome, Ngartia.
Check. Thank you. Good afternoon. Mko fiti? Nice. I'd like to clarify that I was volunteered. And so I shall read a poem. I don't like doing those introductions, so I'll get straight into it. It's called Letter in a Bottle. Turn the clock back. Deliver a message to Axum. Tell them we're building intellectual obelisks. Reach back to Nubia. Speak about lines of codes raising digital pyramids. Standing witness to inherited brilliance. Send a memo to our forebears from the beating heart of the luminous continent. Speak of how we shimmer in the light, sending ripples around a stranded world that seeks resuscitation. Look at what your children did, Nkrumah. Are you watching this, Sankara? The spirit lives on, Madikizela. Listen to the birdsong in this dawn of an era. From the streets of Nairobi buzzing with life, from the shores of Mombasa and Kilwa, every tide continuing a 1,000-year legacy, to color-drenched markets of Accra, from a Cairo that cuddles the Nile's millennia worth of memories, to the golden veins of Johannesburg, through the thrumming, dumping rhythms of Lagos, past the rolling hills of Kampala in the morning mist. Do you hear the sparkling melodies of Bamako's chorus, accompanied by the Nyatitis strummed in Kisumu? Hear them soundtracking our ascent to where we belong on the dimensions of glory. See our hips gyrating to gomas and ngomas. Feel these spirits flying on the back of Kinshasa's guitars. We are carrying the scholarship of Timbuktu in our DNA, the thought work of Alexandria burnt in these skins. See how we leapfrogged centuries to be here, to be this, like this. How we laugh in the face of doubt, daring possibility, wondering what could trip us, what could dare stop us, what could stand in the way now that we speak to each other. Do you not see what we've achieved in isolation? Are you proud, Amani Renas? Do you not root for us, Nzinga? Your descendants are ascending, feeding the tree at the root, pouring love into the cracks, a continental group hug in the hearth, learning from the past to hold ourselves to task, lighting torches to follow paths we chopped out ourselves. There is nothing new in the ancestral realm, and there is nothing new that the ancestors cannot guide us through. We are who we ought to be, rejoicing in the knowledge of assured victory. Rise on, Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ngartia, for setting the tone. Even as you take your sip of coffee, the first question goes to you. Okay, breathe. First question still goes to you. So from your perspective, historically, how did colonial era newspapers and early press institutions shape public acceptance of colonial policies and dispossessions, and what remnants of those framings do we still see in today's headlines? Essentially, this question came to you because you have a lot of history with Tuali for Birds, exploring various historical concepts and context as well, and putting them into context for us and showing us kind of parallels of some of the things we face today. You give us the appreciation that this is not new. These are things that we've lived through before. So how from colonial era perspectives of the newspapers, what are your thoughts?
Well, they influenced a lot. I'm going to use two examples. So number one is Kenyan. We need to understand that the colonial project was not a unanimous project from where it was coming from. Yes, when we were bashing the colonial Brits, we bashed them together. However, there is, as we experience today, there was a split between the administration and the people and all that stuff, right? So by the time, say, for example, the railway line that established this country was being called a lunatic express, it wasn't a compliment. That's a crazy thing. You're building a railway in Africa just to go where? So there was a lot of criticism in that perspective, right? So for the colonial project to be successful, then they had to, what's the media term for when you push people until they give you consent? Manufactured consent. Thank you. They had to manufacture that. And the newspapers were the biggest way to do that, right? So Kenya specifically was advertised as white man's country, right? Those specific words, with the imagery that follows. So imagine the Rift Valley, Kizimama Pale viewpoint, when you see that layout, just that, the painting of that landscape with white man's country being pushed in London, in South Africa for the Boers as well, to bring settlers who then would make the railway make sense, for example. But the biggest tool for that propaganda was newspapers, You can still find a lot of them at the Macmillan Library, for example. They go all the way back to 1902, 1900s, all that. So that's example number one. Number two, I'm starting with that because I think in my head it fits within the zeitgeist. The times, that's what the tools they had. But there is the case of Congo, which to me is a bit more villainous, because I think this is part of where history and journalism meet. On the history side, Dr. Livingstone, with his exploration and all that, had caused a lot of furore at some point. And he was missing. So someone was commissioned to go find him. And that was a journalist. Stanley Morton was a journalist and was commissioned by the New York Herald to cut through Congo to go find Livingstone. And that cutting through Congo was literal cutting through with bullets and everything. So you could argue that a lot of what is the conflict that's still happening in Congo, whether it's on newspapers or not, really kick-started with that, with Henry Morton trying to cut his way through for a story that was being serialized on one of the most popular newspapers, right? So it starts there, goes through all what I would say Binyavanga really defined as in how to write about Africa. I don't want to jump into that, and comes all the way to. I'll connect it to specifically two examples. When Kenyans say, someone tell BBC, and someone tell CNN, specifically Dusit. When Al-Shabaab attacked Dusit, there was such a huge difference in how the reporting of our dead was as compared to the reporting of foreign workers from here who were dead. It was all about color, right? Are you black and African, or are you white, European, or from another place? And then the standards change. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for setting the context for the next question for Chris, which is Ngartia has already explored at least the Dusit instance, where you can see almost Western media cutting through bodies that were laid to waste here in Kenya, right? Have you seen any other instances where contemporary media coverage has actively supported or obstructed reparations movements? And what editorial choices do you, in your perspective, made the difference?
Thank you for that question, Martie. As you've heard, I'm a journalist and the news editor at The Continent. So your question on how the media has supported or obstructed reparations movement, I think the immediate example that comes to my mind is the restitutions that African countries have been asking for of their artifacts from Western museums. By some counts, 70-80% of African artifacts actually are stored in Western museums. And one of the ways that is presented as the right thing and the normal place for African artifacts to be is in the editorial choices that journalists make on who to interview about these artifacts. So if you're interviewing the museum curators of the Victoria and Albert Museum or the British Museum or the Louvre, and those are the, as journalists, we are trained to have expert voices and to find sources that you can include in your story. So those choices of who to ask and who to include actually creates that impression of it's unthinkable that these artifacts can ever return to Africa, because one of the things that has been reported repeatedly is this idea that, well, African museums are not well funded. They're going to be looted. Are they even going to keep them safe? And my question is, safe from whom? Like, who are we keeping them safe from? So I think a lot of this is journalistic conventions that are not really questioned, right? When your editor sends you to go out on a story, who is actually the authority that you turn to for a quote? And if you don't question those conventions, then you end up reproducing these narratives that make empire legible, durable, and as you said in your concept note when you sent to us, it's not just about It's not just about reporting events. It's also about creating an impression on what is right, what is good, what is normal, what will endure. And I think when it comes to the question of, the kind of media reporting that challenges this kind of framings, I think it really takes a lot of courage to do that as journalists, to break the mold and to say, hang on, why am I assuming that this person's seniority or this person's pedigree or this person's professional experience makes them the right person to interview about this problem? What about the person who is caught on the underside of power? What about the person who is dispossessed? What about the person whose knowledge is illegible to Western knowledge systems? What about the person whose viewpoint is actually not visible? And is actually rendered invisible, actually. So I would say that it takes a lot of bravery, a lot of courage, like going against the grain and actually training yourself to not fall into these conventions and instead to actively go against those set out conventions. And in journalism, we have this value that we're taught, which is objectivity. And if you take that to be kind of a term that is neutral, then you end up being objective on the side of power, because power has a gravitational force of its own, right? You will be drawn inevitably onto the side of the powerful, and swimming against the grain and, creating a vision for society that is just, and that actually privileges the marginalized so that we can have a better future is a really active process. So I would say, I'll just give the example, not to plug my publication, but let me just do it. At the Continent, early in the year, we published a series called The Museum of Stolen History. And what we did is we featured 8 artifacts that are in Western museums, but we actually commissioned artists from each of the countries that these artifacts come from. And the brief of the art director who commissioned these artists, she wrote to the artists and she said, imagine this artifact home. How would it be in Africa? Where would it be? Who would be around it? Who would be touching it? How would they be interacting with it? And these artists came back with, the kind of presentation that you've never even considered. I'll give you an example. There's a diamond that comes from South Africa, I believe, the Cullingham diamond. It's like one of the biggest diamonds in the world that is in like Western countries now. I think it's in the UK. And this artist imagined this diamond back home among the Ndebele people. And he said Ndebele people did not value minerals and jewels. What they valued is children, land, cattle, all the things that make our lives possible. And so his artistic rendering of this diamond was a Ndebele child playing with this diamond like it's a toy. And I thought that was so, and the child is delighted because the diamond is beautiful. And so he's having a great time with this, a happy child playing with a sparkling stone. But that is the value of the stone in his rendering of the Ndebele worldview. And I thought that was so powerful. That image has stayed with me since. I could say more things, but I'll hand it back to you, Martie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. And even when you were talking about whose voices are being included in the stories, right? I think in my mind it raised an important question as to even the diversity of the journalists who are covering these stories, right? And looking at it from Joseph's point of view as the senior editor for diversity at The Guardian, there's a temptation most times to look at it from our perspective, but then the conversation does not connect, right, on the Western side, and we wonder why, and you work within the journalism space in the UK. So I'm just curious about just enlightening us about what has your experience been with discourse around reparative justice within the UK's media circles, right? Just bearing in mind also like kind of the guardians slavery past, and understanding what reparative justice means from that perspective.
That's a very big question. I just want to start maybe by just coming back to Ngartia, what you were saying. I think in a way it's worse than you think, because you seem to be thinking that this was a deliberate act by British Western journalists to deliberately put down Africans and portray them in that light. But as Chris was saying, our UK Western journalists think they're being impartial. They actually believe this about Africans, they believe it about Caribbeans, they believe it about African Americans. They've imbibed that sense, that centuries-old narrative of white people being in the ascendant, black people being inferior, and that's just, so they will just churn out stuff. You see it in the coverage that's going on at the moment in how immigration is being covered in the British press in particular, about these hordes of people from Africa and the Middle East, even worse if they're Muslim, coming into our country to invade us, to sponge off us, to take from us, because they have nothing to offer. And that sense of black people having nothing to offer goes back to that sense of Africa having not done anything in its past. That, what can this continent and what has it ever created? So it's so deep rooted now. It's people do it unthinkingly, as you say. This is how they feel is objective reporting. It's and the kind of stereotypes. What doesn't help is that the British press or the Western press is often run by a very tiny elite of very expensively educated, Oxbridge-types, middle class, who know themselves. They've got to their jobs because they know each other very well, and their views are rarely challenged. The views you see it now in the last 2 years of the coverage of Gaza. That sense of Palestinians actually being human beings. It took months for them to actually realise that, because they don't meet Muslim people in their daily lives. They take in all those stereotypes about, warmongering savages, and that's how they just see it, as a divide between the civilization that Israel represents and the barbarism that the Palestinians represent. And you could take any conflict going on. Africa is covered in its war, famine, poverty, or it's not covered at all. So the stories about the true Africa, the true stories of East, West, Southern Africa, Northern Africa, they don't make it into the UK media. The only stories are of the crises and the humanitarian crises and the wars and the conflicts. So it's a really big challenge. And so in what I've done at The Guardian, I've been working and pushing on diversity and inclusion at The Guardian for 25 years now. Even at The Guardian, which is by far the most liberal news organisation within Britain, even at The Guardian, it was a struggle to get people to accept, and Chris, you talked about challenging the groupthink. That is, even at The Guardian, it was a real challenge for them to, we know racism's bad, but, so what can you tell us about race or racism or black culture or anything? It was like, you've got nothing to offer us. And so it was a long process, as I say. It's years and years of work it's taken. In 2020, after obviously the Black Lives Matter protests, I was given a full-time job, which effectively gave me a full-time job doing what I'd been doing in my own time up to then, of diversity and development editor. And it's given me a chance to sort of take this and give this whole, trying to include new voices and give it a much more attention, much more firepower. But it's a journey that we are on at The Guardian. It's a journey that most British newspapers have barely started, if at all. And so when we talk about reparations, and when we have that conversation, whether it's African Americans talking about it, or Caribbeans talking about it, or here in Africa people talking about it, you need to realize where the Western thinking is. And it's, if you talk to most British people about slavery, what was Britain's involvement with slavery? And they'll say, yeah, William Wilberforce, he abolished it. And that's the story that they know very little about the centuries that preceded that. They don't even know that he didn't even abolish slavery, that slavery continued several decades after he abolished the slave trade. But there's that, we're up against a lot, and people wanting to say it's ancient history, people not wanting to acknowledge that it's very much the legacies of slavery still go on to this day. that in the perceptions of black people to this day, and the wealth and poverty inequalities that were embedded 2 centuries ago, and which still haven't been undone. If you don't have land, if you don't have wealth, if you don't have property, how are you meant to narrow the inequality gap? How you have no access to wealth or wealth creation. So that's why it endures, and why it's a wrong that still needs to be righted so long afterwards. And I don't want to talk too long. I can talk about our own project and program.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask you, what does reparative journalism look like at The Guardian, practically?
At The Guardian, we realised that our own founders had made... The money that founded The Guardian was created through slavery, because it was created by cotton merchants in Manchester who bought their cotton from the United States. So it's slavery, the product of slavery. If you go to anyone in the US, they'll say cotton, yeah, that's slavery. But if you go to people in the UK, they don't know that story. So we discovered this, and the question was what to do with it. So I was put in charge of a program called the Legacies of Enslavement program. And we created a 10-year program which involves new journalism positions, correspondence covering Africa, the Caribbean, South America, the US and the UK, covering descendant communities and new regions of the world, and telling this story and coming up with a direct reparative justice work which is centering on descendant communities in Jamaica and in the southern United States, where the Guardian founders made their money through cotton. So there were conversations, but I think for us, the diversity and the inclusion work was a necessary prerequisite to all of that. They're not only thinking that diversity is something as like an act of charity. We'll let some black people into our building because we don't like racism, but getting them to the point that they recognise that is actually, as Chris was saying, a necessary thing to make us a good news organisation, to be able to cover the world and the country as it is, rather than as it's seen from a tiny number of people who are ignorant about many things, no matter how clever they are. So recognising that diversity and inclusion is a good thing then leads to, we need to do something important about this history of ours, which we've just discovered. So I'll finish there, but it's a 10-year programme, and we want to make significant, meaningful and long-lasting changes, and hopefully by the end of the decade we can be judged on that.
Thank you, Joseph. I think just listening to your response kind of made me realize that maybe we've taken something for granted. And this question goes to Beatrice Ngartia. Chris, you can also feel free to answer it, but who decides what repair looks like? We've spoken a lot about reparations, but specifically when it comes to media and the communities that media serves, who decides what repair looks like?
Well, that's quite a straightforward question, but also it opens the can of worms. I would like to actually open this point, because I believe the media, since time immemorial, reports, watches, tells the story of a people, regardless of the times or the civilizations. But who get to decide what repair and what civilization is? Before we can talk about civilization, before we can talk about repair or reparations, let's talk about civilization. Who gets to decide that today's world is today's civilization and that there were no other civilizations there before? And the people who get to decide what civilization is the class of world elite that are in power today. And our stories, I have a bias for Africans because I'm first African, and it's also a genetical truth. Africans always had their own civilization. We had ways we told our stories. That is cliche, we know all that. But when colonization comes to Africa, or when the face of colonization came to Africa, and East Africa to be precise, there were other places where colonization had happened. There was colonization in the US, all that had happened. But the stories about the circle of life where we begin are told in our oral stories. So while we get to decide what our world was, because it's still there, it's still in our story, it's still in our art, the stories of our people are only told or only experienced through art and culture. The media barely gets to interact with art, culture, and our stories from a point of questioning power, from a point of, we do not want as Kenyan media to talk about the Mau Mau War from a point of it's only Kimathi that was there. We want to hear about Pio Gama Pinto. We want to hear about the role of the Indians and how all of us, number one, we are humans and how we were largely affected as humans before we can even go to the question of race and color. So the world elite have had the longest desire, even right now as we begin to talk about Africa rising, Africa, the new dawn for Africa, a new world and how it will look like with Africa on the forefront. They have always wanted to make sure that Africa is either producing the cultural artifacts that they can give value to, either through the extractive economies, our gold and the diamonds and the stones we are talking about. But did these stones have sentimental values to Africans? Yes, they do. Why? Because today I'm wearing a Maasai regalia worn by young women, and there are beads here. Where I come from, these beads are called shioma. Shioma means something that is carved out of a stone. So this bead is an ornament because it has been taken out there as a beautiful thing to behold, look and love and fall in love with. But what is it to these people where I got it from? It's an identity. It's part of them. It's who they are. Where I came from or where I come from, where I'm born, I got to learn from Mau Mau history, reading Mau Mau books that we wore, as late as 1960s, we were still wearing our skins. When people went to Kirigiti Stadium to before they went to the forest, there was such a huge political rally between the liberals and the old people, the radicals, from when the youth were forming. The youth in Kenya towards the independence war were forming right from the 1900s. So it's an intergenerational war again. So we have a whole stories about Africa that exist deeply within our oral literature. But the role of the media and where the media has been losing it out is where they get to thematically and intentionally and intrinsically dig out the stories and bring them out, not necessarily in Muzungu's language or this foreign language, but in a language that synonymously and intentionally gets out there to any other person who may not understand this. So culturally, and I'll also talk about the environment. Culturally, we Africans are in charge of our stories, but they get to define the aesthetics of whether our stories are valuable or not. Why? Professor Ngartia Mūrūthi, one lady I really respect to death, she said that culture is a code. And how they attacked our code is that they know we as Africans always thrive within our nature, our ecological, forming and everything about it. So when they came, the first thing they attacked was our environment. Our environment involved having festivals as this. I could talk about a festival I love so much. It's called the Festival of the Full Moon, because growing up, we used to love dancing or singing to the full moon on the night of the super moon. We used to love doing that. But when I come to Nairobi, the best I can do is watch that. When I go to look for a full moon face of this month, I'll probably get an article by The Guardian or by a foreign press telling us what the face of the moon is to us. But when I go back to the countryside, am I able to celebrate that? No. Why? Because that is no longer fashionable, and we have to listen to news and go to bed and do certain kind of things, because that is a civilization that the media over time in 150 years has given to the people of East Africa, to the people of Africa, that when you want to tell your story, when you want to tell stories like this, you'll be asked, where is your story written? Where are the facts about your stories? So that leads me to the AU fact book. Again, still written by hands that work together with the class of world elites. I think it's planned in a way that Africa has to remain at the base. But now it's time we start having these conversations on how the AU facts, the facts by AU fact book, move out of that into probably mainstreaming into our grassroots, where I am at, doing, travel journalism, collecting stories, probably don't have a place to publish apart from my social media, but I'll be there stubbornly saying that in 1952, by the time we had the state of emergency in Kenya, one of the things that the media played big in this country was to start the tribal narrative that was induced by the white, the colonizer who wanted to make this community inferior against that community. And I think the question of language, the question of, even before you can talk about our DNA, the question of where our information is and how it's stored is where we begin this conversation, because they told our stories using their language, but we cannot entirely just access our stories because you'll be asked, Miandiko wapi, where are they written? So since we do not have the manuscripts, another thing they did is that they took our own manuscripts, not just the artifacts that include, the physical things we can touch, but how we used to write. And it's quite intriguing that how we used to write is could be in today's keyboards. The emojis and how we used to inscribe our writings could be today's emojis. So what is civilization? And did we write before this English and today's writing was here? Yes. Do they recognize that we have characters that are in our local languages that are not entirely just recognized, but just keyed in on the world keyboard? So it's a question of education, it's a question of roots and how our stories are inscribed. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Like, it sets the stage, but I think the question still remains. Who decides what repair looks like? Ngartia, you can.
Since we mekanyagia, I'm gonna go right there. To be honest, I think it's all the parties involved. It's the subject, whose stories are these, or who is being written or spoken about. The people doing the telling, so the media institutions and everyone within that ecosystem, and the audience, right? And the reason I've split it like that is because it's also not that clear. It's usually a cycle. So even when stuff is being created to serve a Western audience, for example, a lot of times it's still being sold to us. I'll scroll up my Instagram, I'll find a story that's clearly not written for me, but still want my money. I had a long fight with Medium a while back where you could subscribe, so they could take your money from Africa, but as a writer, you could not be paid. Right? So they're like, to take your money, we'll use anything. PayPal, Nini, what do you have? We'll take it. Visa, great. You need to get paid. Oh, man, do you have Stripe? Oof. It's unfortunate. It's only available in, they look like white countries, but we wouldn't say that on the map, right? So because that cycle is like that, you have to involve every single person. Or at some point, they're going to involve themselves. So my main example is, the mood we're in as a nation in the passing of Raila is very reminiscent of when Tom Mboya was assassinated, or at least the funeral rites after that, and the grief of specifically the Luo nation, right? And so last week I was going through some of our research material, and I came across the footage from Mboya's funeral that was it's still under British apartheid. And one of the things that popped out from that video in the conversation in the comments was the voiceover. So you can see very clearly it's shot during Mboya's Requiem Mass outside also in the Basilica in the CBD. Mourners outside, and then there's a very distinguished and prim and proper mourners. Violence starts outside, and you can clearly see uniformed police officers beating the hell out of citizens, right? But the voiceover at that very specific moment is racial tribal tensions between the Kikuyu and the Luo tribe. It's like, bro, these are the police. Where are the Kikuyus and the Luo? Like, you can see it very clearly, right? This 55 years later, you have people in the comments who are the grandchildren of the people being beaten saying, hey, that something doesn't make sense between the voiceover and this, and then relating it to what's happening right now, where again it's Kikuyus and Luos. So it's a thing that was set up, as she was saying, that we're still exploiting to this day, or specific people or institutions are exploiting, right? So the question then becomes about ownership of both the stories and the means to tell the stories. So who owns the media, right? I'm in a very embarrassed situation. I offered to write something for a particular media organization that's owned within the political system, and now the political system has shifted, and now they're no longer doing the kind of stories they were doing, right? So that matters. When we are doing our stories on stage, the story of ownership doesn't just start with who lived this life. It gets to, now that you're telling it and you need money to tell it, who's giving you the money and what do they tell you to do with that money, right? And all the way back now to the person being written about or consuming that story. Are you going to accept it? So if you're consuming a story that's written about someone else, as we all have been, I'm going to actually limit it to Kenya specifically at the moment because it's, as we are all consuming stories about different communities around the country, right? What do you choose to accept and run with? And what do you choose to react against? As you're telling stories as a storyteller, which biases are you not even aware you have? And as you're telling a story within an institution, or as you're consuming a story that's coming from a particular media institution, who owns it? And what's the agenda? And what do they stand to benefit if you believe a particular standpoint? So, yes, I believe it's every single person within that ecosystem that needs to actively engage with the material.
Thanks.
If I may, being an editor, I once started at the Kenya Editors Guild shortly before 2022 elections because things happen that do not objectively have to make you be included in spaces. So the question on media's objectivity, I believe at this point, the media cannot shape something that it's not informed about. If you look at all state functions in Kenya, or anything to do with travel, culture, tourism, it's all about sensationalizing different Kenya tourist spots or different Kenyan stories. Or now I was saying, like yesterday, but when the celebrations, Mashujaa celebrations or somewhere in Kitui, it's all about taking an event to a place without necessarily bringing the people of that place to tell their story. It's all about a president giving a speech and not about the Oloibon of that area telling the story about the first Oloibon of that area. So what did the Oloibon of that area do 120 years ago? As people of that area today, what other new culture and stories have been born, or what are the new ways in today's world that are marrying into the civilization that was back then and right now? So the question of reparations comes back. The question of comes to the answer of healing. Who gets to lead us on world healing? Because if the media is not informed about what it needs to report about, it will always report our stories. It will always tell our stories from the lens of the foreign media. Why? Let's talk about Nation Media Group, Aga Khan Foundation. It's as old, I think, as 1900s or 1910s or something. That is a foreign player in Kenya. I want to believe so. There's another foreign player somewhere. There's another different press somewhere in Tanzania. What is the origin or the genesis of that media house? What kind of stories do they tell? What is their view about Kenya? What is their view about East Africa? Is it still being imported from our colonizers? When you go to other countries that were not colonized by the Britons, when you go to, for instance, is it Cameroon? There's a place where they speak two languages. There's the central side, there's the other side where they speak different languages. Who gets to define healing? I think Africa will get to define healing and reparation and what looks for us. Why? Because part of our erased civilization is still in our DNA, and it's coming back alive through the people that are alive today. Our stories are still alive in our oral literature, but sometimes they get erased out. So our healing has to come from a point where we have to be honest again with ourselves. Did religion replace culture? Did culture affect religion? Are our other generations, like our parents, vehemently still practicing religion in a way that it affects our ways? Is it making the new generations confused about who they are? Is the extraction happening in Congo making the people there not live like they should, because their dignity is something that the political governments in East Africa and the rest of Africa have failed to address decisively? How has it affected, how the decades, war, how has it affected the ways of the people of that place? So it's a conversation that needs to happen from a political side, from the economical side, from the cultural and religious side, and we need to have to stop having the double standards about calling colonizers and foreign governments on their involvement in eroding our culture and our other practices, for instance, our crafts that were embedded in our culture. So it's a question on humanity needs to start healing itself, and we can't heal as well without, again, interacting with our nature, because part of our craft, again, is embedded and it's still written within the DNA that is still in nature and its trees and everything that has to do with it. So it's an honest conversation, but the media gets to tell it. So you can imagine we have an editor somewhere who is livid about these facts, who thinks about being of a certain tribe is synonymous to being an evil person, or, not necessarily being right within the ways and the rituals of the religion that is foreign. So the media needs to, let me not say it, but let me just say it as bluntly, because I don't want to continue seeking consent like the media has been seeking consent to publish our stories. I want to say the media needs to decisively and be unapologetic about how it tells our stories. And how it tells our stories means they have to go, dig, research, and stop treating communities like case studies, because researchers have a habit of treating communities like case studies. Let's stop treating our audience like case studies or examples we have to talk about. Let's treat them like people who have given birth to us and people from communities where we belong. So we must tell our stories without fear of what we keep on seeking consent up there from our colonizers to talk about. Thank you. I mean, the kind of confidence from Ibrahim Traore. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's interesting that you say that. I don't know how many of us saw the case for artifacts being stolen from the Louvre last week, right? And when you listen to the coverage of that from Western media, it was really interesting. Even the president gave his voice to it, someone has stolen our artifacts, this is our culture being robbed, this is our, there was a lot of kind of empathy and sympathy, and people are like, oh my God, who could steal from the Louvre, who could rob it, And then it's so strange that this is the same country that we are asking for our artifacts. This is the same country, even when the Olebon was speaking in the opening ceremony, just saying that we have to go and see the remains of our dead. We have to fly to the UK or to France. Just talking about that double standard, it's interesting because that's where we are at right now. And this is a bit of a contradictory question just based on what we've just spoken about. But I'd like Chris and Joseph to try and tackle it. Because the reality is that most of the coverage is done by Western media outlets, right? And whereas they cover their stories in a very empathetic and sympathetic way to their cause, right? And to the citizenry. And then our stories are given some sort of kind of, it's like a back burner type of no empathy, no sympathy, no understanding, or a limited understanding, right? So what do you think is the responsibility, especially given your position as senior editor at The Guardian, Joseph, what responsibility do legacy Western media institutions and their Africa desks have to dismantle colonial framing in their reporting, and what practical steps would be required?
They do have the responsibility for it. That's, again, it's easier said than done. I think something that really hit me, I remember when you mentioned about tribes and the use of that language, and you're talking about, because in the Western mind, it's a really simple explanation for everything that's happening in Africa. It's the tribes. It was even in South Africa, it was like the Zulu v the Xhosa, and across you name it. And it really struck me when the Bosnian War broke out in the early 1990s, and suddenly this was basically another tribal conflict between Serbs and Croats, but it's the fall of communism, and this is the reason, and this is all the political things, and then there's a whole narrative about the lead build up to the war and the conflict. If it was Africa, it would just be, well, tribes, that's what they do all the time. And again, that kind of constant dehumanization of Africans and black people more broadly. So the media does have a responsibility. It's actually very easy to do once you decide and you think, well, actually, I'm going to investigate what's really happening here. I'm going to treat black people like I would treat white people. That might make a difference. These discussions, I want to see the full spectrum. We did, and it was quite a long time ago. We did a short analysis of coverage in The Guardian and how coverage was between races, and we discovered that essentially white people, not surprisingly, were covered way more positively than negatively. Asian people were covered way more negatively than positively, because all the stories that affected Asians were about Islamic extremism or grooming gangs or that kind of thing. Black people were reported equally positively and negative. All the negative stories were the ones we know about, the crime and everything else. The positive stories were all about sport and entertainment. So even in telling a positive story, it keeps to the old narratives and the old stereotypes. And the answer to that is not by, if we're talking about covering Africa as a continent and these issues, it's not to say we're not going to cover any of the negative stuff anymore, because clearly wars and conflict and crime has to be covered. But it's just the fact that we're never seen in those positive perspectives. You'll have the have-a-go hero stories, or the lifestyle stories, or the or the food stories. These kind of cultural issues that they're never the everyday people just doing extraordinary things. Those stories were never covered when it came to black people, and they're never covered when it comes to the African continent, because people have it in their heads that these are the stereotypes. People like stereotypes. It's very easy for journalists to frame it in a people like us and people not like us kind of way. And that sells fear of people who are not like us. That sells newspapers. The responsibility is there. The responsibility is to tell people about this story about Britain's and the West, how it grew rich off the back of slavery and colonialism, and how those who are the victims are still suffering. That's a responsibility for them to tell the whole story. But they don't like telling the whole story because it involves telling some uncomfortable truths which don't sit well with their readership, or when it's politicians, it doesn't sit well with their electorate. But yeah, that responsibility absolutely has to be there. For me and for us at The Guardian, it's about telling the truth. It's about giving a fuller picture. It's about telling people of the world as it is rather than as they'd like it to be. It's about having an adult, grown-up conversation. But it's an uncomfortable one, so I can see why people don't do it, but it's very simple. Once you make a decision to do that, it's very easy to actually cover it like that.
Sorry, just to go a bit deeper into that. At the beginning, you mentioned that The Guardian is more liberal, and yet there are more right-leaning publications in the UK. What has your experience then been in the attempt to repair as The Guardian, right? How has that played out with the rest of the publications within the UK media circles?
Well, when we launched our Legacies of Enslavement programme, it was absolutely no surprise to us that the rest of the media reported it negatively. They had a go at us, we're opening a can of worms if we're saying, where will it all end? If you have these conversations and rake up the past, where will it all end? Which is exactly our point. That's what we want. We want a long conversation. We want more rocks uncovered. But the problem is that these conversations don't even start at senior levels in these organisations. It's a negative. We don't want to go there. Don't talk Britain down, don't talk our history down. The classic is don't rewrite history, when, as any historian knows, history is constantly being rewritten. That's what history is. It's a story of rewriting. Going back to the dawn of the universe, that story has been rewritten many times. So that's the reaction that you get. We are not interested in this. We don't see, it's a long time ago, stop raking up the past. Slavery is not the only, lots of other countries have had slavery in the past, kind of get over it. And so it's a real hostility towards doing this. And it's a real job of work to try and have people understand what that other story is that they're not hearing at the moment.
Chris, just to go back to the question that Joseph was answering, especially in light of kind of the hostility that Joseph has described from UK publications, what responsibility do you believe legacy Western media institutions and their Africa desks have to dismantle colonial framing in their reporting? And what practical steps do you think should or would be required?
Thanks, Martie. Just out of principle, I have a slight aversion of talking to Western audiences and Western people. I don't like being in the position where I tell them how to be better people. I think they can go through their own journey, clarify their values, and come out better people at the end of their eat, pray, love journey. Yeah. I will instead speak to local African media, which unfortunately a lot of the times just imbibes Western standards. What African media believes is good journalism sometimes is just Western conventions. So we end up reproducing those harms even without having actual white people around. And you know, we don't need to have a white editor to actually operate in whiteness. And for me, I think as Africans, we need to clarify our values and figure out who we are in the world. Like I said, the first time I got the mic, if we just follow journalistic conventions without questioning them, then we end up reproducing those harms, even without having white editors in the newsroom, you know. So one of the things that we have done at the continent is clarify our values. And for us, our number one value is that we are historical. We are not ahistorical. When you're ahistorical, then you end up, you know, framing things like what Joseph is saying as just like, in this moment, what's the quickest stereotype? This is the stereotype. And if you're ahistorical, then you can have, let me give the example of Haiti, which is like the clearest example. This is a country that freed itself from slavery, but France threatened to invade it and annihilate it. And in order for that not to happen, they were forced to agree to pay back France compensation for freeing themselves. They were France's property, but they needed to compensate France for their own freedom. And these payments ended up going for, you know, almost 150 years. And at some point, Haiti was unable to pay France these payments. And so France actually loaned them money, put them into debt so that they can pay France. You understand? So if you are ahistorical, then all you say is that Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. But you don't add the sentence because this happened, you know. So for us at the continent, we, you know, our voice and our politics and our position is open, and it comes through the reporting. We are anti-colonial, we are pro-reparations, you know, we are anti-exploitation, and our stories do have that voice. And the majority of our readers appreciate our open stated politics, because I believe it's more important to be transparent than to try and reach for an objectivity that ends up just serving power, you know. So that's what I can say about that. I think the question on what to do differently is just to watch what we are normalizing, you know. When the slave trade was abolished in the mid-19th century, Britain ended up, so for example, the island of Barbados at one point was the richest country in the world because of the sugar plantations there. And when the slave trade was abolished, Britain actually compensated the slaveholders for the loss of their property, right? And where did they get the money? They got the money from the profits of the sugar industry. But they never compensated the slaves. And what the slaves had lost was, the enslaved people, was their lives. You know, the erasure of not just their history and their heritage, but really the theft of their lives, of their time and of their labor. And that labor and that time was never compensated. But the idea that it was obvious and right and logical to compensate the property owners for the loss of their property, that's an exercise in normalizing some things. That it just sounds logical that if you lose property that you will get compensation. But, there was no question of who has actually been stolen from, So I would just say that that journey of figuring out your position and your politics and your values and why you exist as a journalist and what you're here to do and how the world looks like once your work is done, it's really hard work. But if you skip that step, then you end up just serving the powerful, even, unintentionally. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. I think the audience, if there's anyone with questions, you can prepare them. But I believe Chris has set us on a nice journey of kind of repair on what can we do differently. So I think we'll just go around just reflecting on that question and sharing your thoughts based on everything we've discussed today and based on what your personal opinions have been around media and memory and repair. Just letting us know what, if for storytellers and journalists in the audience, what can we do differently as a collective so that we're all on the same page?
Okay, what can we do different? We need to be alive to our narratives as Africans before we can even start writing in our newsrooms. And I know we have traditional media and we have digital media. There is also people behind the systems, and I can see one of us here, people working in tech. When we go to those spaces, when we sit in those spaces, we are very intentional by saying that tech, what are they called? Tech is developers, yes, tech developers from Africa, from Kenya. We need to also do something better, not just traditional media, not just digital media users. We need to call out tech developers for making sure that whatever sometimes they are producing is not Afrocentric. What do I mean? I'll go asking a question on maybe AI, and AI will be giving me results that are Western-centric, and that does not necessarily bring me into context on what I'm working on. So I would like to ask us, those ones who are in the tech world, to keep on the fight, to ask developers to code or do whatever thing they are doing in a way that they have Africa in their mind. They are conscious of our lived experiences. They are conscious of our stories. And then to the media, I think one of the most dead side of the media today is media that is doing historical work in terms of collecting. And this is very technical. It's not a thing that we just talk about. We have to go down there, collect stories. And sometimes, and Ngartia will agree with me here, you'll collect stories and we have to still use their medium for storage. We have to use their platforms for storage. But when I want to access a very crucial, reference material, reference cutaway to use as I tell my story about the Mau Mau War, I have to probably go and buy it out of AFP somewhere, and that comes with a cost. Why? Because a journalist back in the day took that content and uploaded it there, and it still can be used there. But when a fellow journalist is approaching me, because I have lived that experience, a journalist was approaching me to go do a story for, I think, international media, if I'm not wrong. I can't quite remember, but a celebrated media outlet. They do not want to meet the cost of the work that I went and produced from the communities down there. So we have to invest in terms of not historical journalism, but travel journalism, because I had a talk with one friend called Tom Wolf, and we were talking about why we have inconsistencies on our narratives. We have inconsistencies in our narratives because we have the oral stories out there, but we are not writing, and we are not writing in our languages. And if you have our stories are told in our languages, we are not taking time to translate them. And if you have to translate them, that is labor that must be compensated. So who is telling our stories from the grassroots? How enabled are they to tell the travel journalism? I think that is something that traditional media can embrace and take a notch higher to reproduce stories about our people from where they are, from where the stories meet them and their traditions meet them, and from where they practice them. Let us not tell stories because President Ruto today traveled to Turkana and he met the culture of the people there, is a San culture, and then let me allude to the work that one L.B. Leakey did. L.B. was a brother of Richard Leakey. L.B. Leakey, well, the brother was in archaeological sites telling the stories. This gentleman, this guy, this white person, this who came, after the colonizers, or probably with the colonizers, he went down to villages, he lived with them, he learned their languages, and he tried to tell the stories of those people now in English, but from a point of translation. That was work he put. He was sent here to do that work, I don't know. Was he here to do the work that every other person that wants to be at an advantage of the communities does? And that is research work. So you'll be seeing we Africans giving out very crucial information to these researchers who are coming, simply because the race question again has not been ardently addressed in our grassroots, and we'll be giving very valuable information. We'll be having film producers telling the stories about how people were displaced during the Mau Mau War, but we are not again going back to tell the stories of how people were displaced before 1900, the radical period of construction and industrial development in East Africa. We're not going back to tell those stories. So I was quite emotional, and I had to keep quiet when the King and Queen of Britain came to Kenya. Is it Britain? Okay. Well, when they came to Kenya, the UK, when they came to Kenya, and there was that whole state visit that they had to be taken to places that the traditional leaders of those places had not assented to, that they had to come and explain, we are coming here to do these things. But when you go to social media, my fellows, they were calling those people that were here for a state visit, the King and Queen, they were calling them the landlord. That phrase in itself, widely used on social media, tells the mind of the people, us Kenyans, the youth, the younger generations, that is not perhaps ignorant of history, but sometimes you'll be like, you know what, you have not told us everything that we needed to know, so that is gone, we start afresh. But we are starting afresh from what? Is it a civilization, a culture that is new to us, or are we going as Gen Zs, as younger millennials, as us, to continue devising cultures that are good for us because they come from us? Why? Because culture is born each day. Things change, yes, but what is the basis of our culture? How must we tell our stories? Will the media only report what they are seeing, or will the media, and especially traditional media, go back and dig the stories from where they are? Are they going to invest in digging the work, like those people that have to do the technical work have to do to travel and bring the stories from where they are? So let's stop telling our stories as if they're just tourist attraction stories to be told, but let's be decisive and be intentional about how we write them, how we tell them, and access to information. Access to information is why we'll be having people from the outside world enjoying the organic bit of our beautiful Kenya. But on the other side, we are still dealing with foods that are inorganic, and we're still using farming ways that are, not organic for us. Why? Because of the kind of reparation that needs to happen. A lot of people who are displaced, a lot of people are living in spaces where, yes, they should be farming, but what are they farming? They're farming teas that they have to sell for them to buy food. So the question of reparations comes back to our genetics, our environment, our national code. And when did it become a national code? Is Kenya as old as 1963, or were we people before colonization? We were definitely people. So we must go back to our ways, and the media must decisively and be intentional about digging these stories and asking these questions, because I did not have a landlord in Kenya 2 years ago. I had a visitor visiting Kenya where I am a landlord, not a tenant. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Beatrice. So just in the spirit of time, before I give you 1 minute each to wrap up, questions? Okay.
How do you want us to do it?
Okay, I thought there was a microphone back there.
Thank you so much, panel, for your insights. Just to kick us off, colleagues, we need to go to Toni Morrison, who says racism is a distraction. The moment you try to play the game of proving that you are the civilization, the same people will come back to you and say, well, what about science? And then say, yeah, we invented this and all that. It's not going to end. It's a rabbit hole. That period is past. Achebe addressed it. We are done with the past of trying to assert that we are a people with a history, with dignity and all that. I think we've got to move on from that and just have the autonomy, just like what Christine is saying. Our autonomy of who we are and how we tell our stories. This anxiety about the other is totally misplaced. Why is it also misplaced? Because we're giving power to the media that is long gone. What is the media? The traditional media has no power anymore. There was a time when the editor of a Sunday newspaper set the agenda for the nation for the whole week. It doesn't happen. In South Africa, the Sunday Times has got 2 investigative journalists. It does not set the agenda. If it will print, remain a print newspaper in the next 12 months, that would be a miracle. That's gone. What has come in? Social media has come in. People who actually on TikTok, you can have somebody with 2.3 million followers. That's a broadcaster. That person has got influence. What are they doing? If you just take this South African scenario, you find somebody doing news analysis in Zulu, you find somebody doing financial literacy in Xhosa, on that, one person on that. That's the media. That's where it is at. When the Afrikaners and Trump and all that were doing their things against South Africa because of the case around Palestine, the most influential page on X was something called History SAZAR. It's the most influential page on account on X for South Africa. Why? Because that one person behind it deliberately went into the history of apartheid and what this whole system did to dehumanize people. Every single day, this person serves pictures, whatever, and people are just like, wow, I was never taught this. Wow, this person is not connected to any media, but this has become so influential, intentional, somebody, an individual doing those kind of things. It's also happening with podcasts. Easy, low cost as it were. The biggest podcast in South Africa now, Podcast and Chill, we might argue about this and Quibo, but totally different, employing 40 people, whilst every so-called influential media is downsizing and is in a crisis. There's a podcast that's thriving, and that's a whole market, as it were. So let us look at media differently and what we can do. I have a son, just last point. I have a son who is 21 years old, never reads a newspaper, doesn't watch television. Much of his stuff is from TikTok. He just knows, okay, I follow this person for my basketball stuff. I follow this person for this and that and that. We can discuss Gaza, on that. He's informed on that. That's it. That's the media, colleagues. And I think let's broaden our view of what constitutes the media. Thank you.
Hi. Quick question. I have 2 quick questions. The first question is, we have seen how Kenyan journalists have been reporting on, the story in Laikipia with where they frame local Maasais as bandits when most of the land is actually owned by white settler descendants, right? So what do you think is the problem there? Is it that Kenyan journalists lack the political consciousness grounded in decoloniality, anti-capitalism, and is that a gap that you see in Kenyan mainstream media space? And what can be done to remedy that so that they have the political consciousness to paint the stories as it is? And then the other thing is that what do you think are the limitations that are caused by Kenyan media being owned by the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production, and how does that affect the stories that we are told or we receive today?
Yeah, I just want to come back. I won't answer the Kenya-specific question. I'll come back to the gentleman at the back. I think you're right that media habits are changing and that young people are not reading newspapers and not even reading websites, particularly at the moment. My own kids would completely reinforce what you're saying. But we kind of get fooled into thinking it's about readership. It's not about readership. It's about who's influential. Who do politicians listen to? In Britain, the newspapers, in terms of their readership, has been on the wane for 20 years. But what matters, the Sun front page or the Telegraph front page or the Times front page, even to some extent I'd like to think the Guardian front page, actually influences politicians. It may not even influence the Prime Minister, but it will certainly influence a lot of backbench MPs. So we can get fooled into thinking that mainstream media, traditional media, doesn't matter, while all these privileged white people control the agenda and think, oh yeah, your social media. Young people don't run the country. They will do it one day, but right now, the influence, young people's views on Gaza, if that was the case, Netanyahu would be at the International Criminal Court before you could say Jack Robinson, whatever. But that's not happening, and that just shows the relative power of mainstream traditional media and social media. So just to put that into context. So given that I believe, and I would say that, wouldn't I? But I do believe that traditional media is important. And it sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but I do think that getting our own people into these positions, Christine, you mentioned that, making white people feel better is not something you need to waste your time with. Maybe in the West and Britain, we don't have that luxury of being able to ignore those powerful people. And so getting people into the media is really important, and how I explain in part of my role what's the difference between diversity and inclusion. And people often don't know the difference. Diversity is getting a few brown people in the building. Inclusion is actually listening to them, hearing their stories, valuing what they say, and making them feel respected and heard and part of the organisation. And to do that, and the reason I say that is that it's important that we get people from different backgrounds into our media, having their voices heard, changing the agenda, getting new perspectives in our in the media agenda. I've been doing that. There's a program I run at The Guardian. It's been running for 20 years called the Positive Action Scheme. It was initially specifically targeted at Black and Asian aspiring journalists. We've had over 300 people have gone through that in the last 20 years. Many of them have gone on to senior positions in the UK media. So I think that kind of long-term thing about getting people in positions, getting that person in the room who's able to change the agenda, to be able to affect and influence the discussions, is just a really important part for the long term.
I'll just make a comment about the Kenyan legacy media scene. I think the questions you've asked have the answers embedded in them. Kenya is one of those countries that has a very consolidated media where almost all the owners are political families or politically connected. Not all African countries are like that, but Kenya is one of those. And of course, that has a way of flowing down into the editorial choices, into the storytelling, into the content. One of the clearest ways that plays out is that Kenyan mainstream media discourse is really a conversation among the elite. It's an exercise in elite consensus, right? Which is why there's political news, then business news, and then, the rumors, talk of town, that column, talk of town. And then in terms of the editorial priorities, it's just people in power talking at each other, across to each other and with each other, right? And the stories about the people are really tucked in at the end, maybe a sports story here and there, maybe a feel-good story to be. Have you noticed how the stories about local communities are somewhere in the middle of the news bulletin just as you're about to go for a break? And it's 1 minute and let's move on. But those are the conventions that I think we operate in as journalists. And like I said, it takes a lot of intention to actually question that. And I'll give you an example. Just last week, at the continent, we had a number of stories that we had commissioned from Gaza, our correspondents who write in Gaza. And we work with a news organization based in Cairo called IGAB, and they're the ones who connect us with journalists in North Africa and in the Middle East. And one of the editorial choices we made last week is all the media reporting that we had seen was referring to the Israelis as hostages, the ones who are being held in Gaza, and they were referring to Palestinians who are also hostages of Israel. They were being referred to as prisoners. So Israelis are hostages and Palestinians are prisoners, as they were doing the exchange, right? But we made a choice and we actually wrote it as an editorial note, and we said that we are going to refer to all these people as captives, so that we don't give that legitimacy of, like, because Israel is this state that they get to call their captives prisoners, and then the ones in Gaza are hostages. You understand, like, there's a value judgment that is being made there when you make those choices. So we actually wrote a note and we said, we are actually going to call all of them captives, right? Which is why I'm saying, and that actually took a conversation in the newsroom. It took editors sitting down. One person said, hey, what do you think about this? And we talked about it, and that's where we landed, right? But if you're not questioning your choices in that intentional way, then calling the Israelis hostages and the Palestinians prisoners doesn't even occur to you as you're making a political and a value choice there. You know, you're actually participating in some kind of commentary about whose captivity needs to be sympathized with. You know, because a hostage sounds, you know, oh my God, this person didn't deserve it. But the tens of thousands of Palestinians who were snatched off the street, who had nothing, you know, you can also say the same thing about them. And Israel actually does say that about them. They're like, oh, we're holding these people and they have nothing to do with October 7th. I'm like, wow, that sounds like you're holding them hostage. You know, yeah. So these are the kind of choices that I think little things like that really matter, and they stack up. You know, they stack up in normalizing what is normal and making what is unthinkable actually unthinkable. It's by these small choices that we make as editors and as storytellers, and as, you know, my fellow panelists have put it, like, we have a lot of power in shaping reality. And I think we need to handle that with that level of intention and responsibility.
So just before, I would like Ngartia to close for us with his thoughts. But first, I just wanted to thank everyone for your participation, for listening, for co-creating what repair looks like for us, for sitting with the tensions that have been there, because even just the same way that Joseph was saying that, you know, we have the luxury of not listening to the white people. He may not, but is still doing the work that needs to be done within Western media, so that we can have a semblance of representation, even if we're not asking for it, right? Thank you for sitting with attention. Thank you for introducing social media into it. I appreciate it. And thank you, panelists, Chris, Beatrice, Ngartia, Joseph, for exploring this with us. This underexplored area, and I think we've done a good job in introducing it, at least. So Ngartia, please give us your closing thoughts.
Not post vote of thanks. That's awkward. But I specifically wanted, so I'll start with Laikipia because I'm from there, and that touches a nerve. Laikipia is the part of Kenya that is still colonized. Let's just call it what it is. Yes. I'm from Timau. Most of my relatives worked or still work in the colonial farms. Most of the medical complications they have to deal with are respiratory because of the pesticides, and it's freezing cold in Timau. If you've ever been to Nanyuki, it's freezing cold, and you have to report work at 4 a.m. and work in greenhouses all day. So the thing is, A lot of Kenyans don't even consider Laikipia a colony. But Tuk is right there. Like, we have a British army base right there. And to connect to something Christine said a bit earlier, because the patterns just do be patterning with the Haiti thing. At independence, the UK government fronted the new Kenyan government money to buy land from the settlers that they had stolen from us. And so that happened. But when the settlers were compensated, so those who were willing to leave, and they took the money and took it back to Britain. Well, you've been paying that loan, by the way. This land didn't go to the people who were supposed to be settled. I think we know that. A lot of the freedom fighters were not settled. It went to people in power. My grandparents were a part of the people who should have been resettled. They were not. A lot of those people, like many Kenyans do, just took the thing into their own hands. They're like, to pay shamba, tunaenda kujitafutia. So a lot of them actually put in work to find land, and they had to pay it off for the rest of their lives. My grandparents were part of a group that bought land in Timau. A group of settlers, they got a huge piece of land from a settler who was leaving. To pay for it, they had to take jobs in the surrounding farms that were still owned by the settlers. What's heartbreaking to me is, number one, when I got to Nairobi, I learned a majority of Kenyans don't even know this. For us, it's childhood stories. For the rest of the country, it's like, I mean, we go, it's nice wheat farms, nice canola fields, we take pictures of the yellow flowers, and we post them on Instagram and move. Those pictures are fed on my family's blood, guys. Thank you very much. And it's not just mine. So what happens, I'm speaking from the farmer perspective. What we usually see is now the pastoralist perspective, where we are just the natives. Anyone in Timau, Nanyuki, Doldol, the entirety of Laikipia, just the inconvenient natives who are in the way of these great ranching and conservation projects that we are supposed to all be looking up to. Now the question becomes, when our sisters and our aunties and our friends and the people we grew up with are raped and killed, and when the soldiers go for their training and they burn the surrounding environments, and then the army is sent to kill fellow citizens, the question then becomes, are our storytellers, our journalists, our writers, who are my friends, who follow me on social media, who see me tweeting about this shit, when they write about that, are they actually misinformed or lazy? Right? That's my biggest point. Thank you for the social media one. The only problem is that's the work I do. I know the page you're talking about, and I admire it a lot, but I do that work. And there's someone around called Valerie Ketel. I don't know if she's doing a presentation somewhere, who's doing that on TikTok, on Instagram. One of the biggest problems is, as he said, we're still transitioning. It does look like we're really in the social media and digital world, but we are transitioning. For the work we do, putting stories on stage and on social media, it sucks that you still need to be validated by mainstream media. A huge section of our demographic has been conditioned to only trust a thing they've seen on a very particular headline coming from a very particular news outlet. And if, as an artist, I've not been featured in a particular newspaper or media organization, then I'm not as good. So why would you trust what I'm saying, right? You ask for a closing point, it's one. Can we all stop being such successful colonial projects, please? So we stop looking at, it's on Vogue, so I need, my magazine need to look like Vogue. Fuck Vogue, friends. Do it like you, man. Like, we don't even have to be having these panels and all these history conversations in English. It's a colonial language that still hurts in my mouth, to be honest. Let's not be such successful colonial projects. Mess up your sources. You can't even afford JSTOR and all these academic places that we're forced to go and look for papers. Me, I can't afford them. I don't know if you guys can sustainably afford to go to all these academic, the ivory towers where our history is stored, right? Instead of that, go to your grandmothers. Check the gossip that was going through your aunties, whatever the version of WhatsApp groups was in the 70s. That's where the stories are. Asante.
enough said.